You can join in if you know the song. For I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. Okay, if you know this, you can join in now. Oh, freedom! Oh, freedom! Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. And go home to my love and be free. So that was one of the anthems of the civil rights movement. And it's an expression of one of the powerful ideas we've been discussing, starting with Lynn this morning, with Lyndon LaRouche's discussion of the principle of the sublime. The idea that you must have a mission in life. And the mission in life should be true freedom. But the question of freedom is one that my generation distorted so much that most of you have no real sense of what those words really mean. And what I want to discuss is by looking at somewhat of a history of culture and the battles in culture over the question of what is the nature of man, to get at this question of what true freedom is. And it gets to this question that I put on the board up here. Who owns your culture? Because most of you don't know where your culture comes from. By the end of this presentation, you may be very upset to find out that you don't own it, it's not yours, and in fact, it's poisonous to you. And that to the extent that you embrace any aspect of this modern culture, you have no possibility of being free in your lifetime. So that's what we're going to be discussing this evening. Now, I'd like to begin, as you probably know, this is Dr. Martin Luther King, who did understand this principle. And as Lynn said this morning, Martin Luther King did live a sublime life. He lived for the ages. He paid back to everyone who went before him his debt. And he lived for the future. And he knew that his future may be short, which is why he was free, because no one could take anything away from him. The only thing that could be taken from him was his life. And once he decided that if necessary, he would give his life for the cause, he was totally free. This is a speech that he gave, a section of a speech that he gave when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo.
December 10, 1964, Oslo, Norway.
And speak up.
Civilization and violence are antithetical concepts. Negroes of the United States, following the people of India, have demonstrated that nonviolence is not sterile passivity, but a powerful moral force which makes for social transformation. Sooner or later, all the people of the world will have to discover a way to live together in peace, and thereby transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creating psalm of brotherhood. If this is to be achieved, man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. The tortuous road which has led from Montgomery, Alabama to Oslo bears witness to this truth. I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. I believe that even amid today's motor bursts and whining bullets, there is still hope for a brighter tomorrow. I believe that wounded justice, lying prostrate on the blood-flowing streets of our nations, can be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men.
Now, what you see there is an expression of cultural optimism. What you see is the kind of courage that was necessary to move this nation ahead, to take on the horrible racism that existed in the southern part of this country as well as through most of the rest of the country. There are probably very few of you who grew up in the South. Are there people here who lived in the South? And how many of you lived in the South in the 50s and 60s? I didn't think so. When Dr. King began his organizing, he couldn't stay in most hotels in major cities. He couldn't go to restaurants. If he wanted a drink of water, he had to go to a fountain that said colored only. If you were audacious enough to go up to the board of registrar and ask to register to vote, there was a chance a cross would be burned in your yard, that you would be beaten, that dogs would be sicked on you. And yet people like Amelia Boynton Robinson of the Schiller Institute, the woman who has adopted Lyndon and Helga LaRouche as her godchildren. Amelia Boynton Robinson started this fight in the 1930s. In the case of Amelia and Dr. King, they exemplified this principle of the sublime, the fight for a better humanity, the commitment to bring out the ideal in everyone. The question of art and culture is really the question of what is the nature of man. Now, you heard Lyndon LaRouche say this morning, all human beings are born good, or with the potential to become good. But many of you probably believe, if you were being honest, that we have more in common with animals than we do with the divine quality, which we at least theoretically ascribe to human beings. This is what's taught to us. Darwin's conception of evolution, or social Darwinism, goes back to this theory of Thomas Hobbes, that all men are beasts, that life on this planet is short, miserable, and brutish. And it's a struggle of survival of each against all. Now, that is in fact a fairly accurate description of most of human history. But there have been a handful of people, such as Dr. King, throughout history, who have not only exemplified in themselves the contrary, that is, man in the image of God, but have fought for their whole life for that conception of man in other people. And in many cases, to fight for that, to say to people, especially people who are oppressed, that you have the image of God in you, can get you killed, as it did Dr. King. The forces that would wish to destroy culture, destroy nations, and keep you enslaved, essentially operate from a kind of racialist point of view, that a small grouping, namely the elite, the oligarchy, the ruling families, were somehow born to rule. They were bred to be better. Now, if you look at someone like Prince Charles, who probably believes that, you realize how demented that view is. The guy was probably bred to be a diction coach to tomatoes and corn, who he seems to have quite a bit of fun talking to. But the idea that because of birth someone is better has been imposed on mankind throughout its history. But in order for that to be accepted, you have to reduce human beings to actually believe that they're no different than animals, to believe that there's nothing in their minds that differentiates them from animals, and that in fact humans are beings of senses, that we're controlled by our sense perception. Now, how have we advanced as a species? It's been precisely through some of the discoveries that you saw earlier, that Phil discussed, and that Peter and Skye gave you some insights into. This idea of getting into these great discoveries, getting your hands on bubbles, working through various kinds of exercises that demonstrate to you that the universe is different from what you see, what you can tell from your senses. Now, the purpose of culture, the purpose of art, is to enable you to more profoundly and effectively communicate the quality of mind that's required to make such discoveries and then to convey them. That the advances of human civilization have depended on breakthroughs in what we call the arts, to give people a sense in the visible world or in the audio world of this higher quality of how the universe is organized, and how in fact man is a part of that organization, and in fact a crucial part, that it's man who uses his powers of reason, his cognitive powers, to shape the physical universe. Now, one of the things that came out very clearly from Lynn today is the discussion of the role of Socrates and Plato in this. That without going through this in depth, and a lot of what I'm going to do is touch on things because I want you to do the investigation. First of all, because that's how you're going to learn. That's how you make new discoveries yourself, is to do the hard work. And there's an important reason why you should do that. If these ideas were easy enough for me to explain them to you, we probably already would have a renaissance. The problem is that my generation, on top of everything else, is extremely lazy and always looking for the easiest way to do things. What's the shortcut? What's the bottom line? If they say if there were pills that could make you thin, everyone would take them. If you have to work at it, if you have to think, if you have to do something, well, okay, look at our population. Think about this question of great art and culture and scientific discovery. One of the reasons that people fall for a degraded sense of man in the culture is that it's easy to go with the feelings. It's easy to be happy by something that doesn't take much effort. In fact, if you can just turn on the radio and in a few minutes you're sitting around and, oh man, I feel great. This is really, oh man, this is my music. Whether it's country western, whether it's rock, whether it's klezmer, if you're a modern supporter of Greater Israel, the revival of this craziness. That's the way you get suckered into accepting that something which was created and promoted from the outside is really yours. But the basis of a Renaissance is the development of the powers of cognition that require work. But it's the good work. This is what we're all about, to master nature, to master the ideas and master the means by which we can communicate and pass on the great ideas to the next generation, so that next generation is able to make discoveries, new discoveries. Every Renaissance in history, since the time of Socrates and Plato, has been based on going back to the ideas of Socrates and Plato. And every time we've had a dark age, it's the deliberate assault on those ideas which brought us there. Now, I'm going to begin by introducing you to just a few examples of this great art, which starts with the concept that man does have a divine quality, that we do have something beyond our physical presence and our immediate sense perception. The idea of human dignity, the idea of man as not being a beast, but something different. Now, one example of this is from a 15th century humanist named Pico della Mirandola. Now, the humanist movement, which grew up around Nicholas of Cusa and the Council of Florence, actually the way for it was paved by the great Dante Alighieri of Florence, who was kicked out of Florence when he challenged his local oligarchy. But the idea of humanism started with the rejection of Aristotle. I should have added that every dark age is based on Aristotelian methods. Scholasticism, the idea that you can't know anything, but you can know the order of things. It's the perfect example of what computer science is, or linguistics or logic today, because what the scholastics studied in the Dark Ages was linguistics, only then they called it semantics, and logic. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin was one of the major topics of discussion in the Sorbonne when it was first created. And it still is today, by the way. But the humanists rejected Aristotle and focused instead on the relationship of man and the divine. What is the role of man? What is the nature of man? Quincy, let's hear from Pico de Mirandola, his famous oration on the dignity of man. Well, before you start, what he's talking about here, here's how he starts this essay. He says, now remember, this is a Christian writer in Italy at a time when the Muslim world was considered the enemy. He starts by writing, I once read that Abdullah the Muslim, when asked what was most worthy of awe and wonder in this theater of the world, answered, there is nothing to see more wonderful than man. Hermes Trismegistus concurs with this opinion. A great miracle is man. And so Pico is asking the question, where did man come from? What is man?
Finally, the great artisan mandated that this creature who would receive nothing proper to himself shall have joint possession of whatever nature had been given to any other creature. He made man a creature of indeterminate and indifferent nature, and, placing him in the middle of the world, said to him, Adam, we give you no fixed place to live, no form that is peculiar to you, nor any function that is yours alone. According to your desires and judgment, you will have and possess whatever place to live, whatever form, and whatever functions you yourself choose. All other things have a limited and fixed nature prescribed and bounded by our laws. You, with no limit or no bound, may choose for yourself the limits and bounds of your nature. We have placed you at the world's center so that you may survey everything else in the world. We have made you neither of heavenly nor of earthly stuff, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with free choice and dignity you may fashion yourself into whatever form you choose. To you is granted the power of degrading yourself into the lower forms of life, the beasts. And to you is granted the power, contained in your intellect and judgment, to be reborn into the higher forms, the divine. Imagine the great generosity of God, the happiness of man. To man it is allowed to be whatever he chooses to be. As soon as an animal is born, it brings out of its mother's womb all that it will ever possess. Spiritual beings from the beginning become what they are to be for all eternity. Man, when he entered life, the Father gave the seeds of every kind and every way of life possible. Whatever seeds each man sows and cultivates will grow and bear him their proper fruit. If these seeds are vegetative, he will be like a plant. If these seeds are sensitive, he will be like an animal. If these seeds are intellectual, he will be an angel and the Son of God. And if, satisfied with no created thing, he removes himself to the center of his own unity, his spiritual soul, united with God, alone in the darkness of God, who is above all things, he will surpass every created thing. Who could not help but admire this great shapeshifter? In fact, how could one admire anything else?
That's enough. That's fine. Now, this idea of man was the idea that Shakespeare brought to his characters. Not always as the ideal, as we see in this next passage, which is a speech of Hamlet, who is conflicted internally as to whether he was great or whether he was miserable.
What a piece of work is a man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a God. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals.
This is the humanist conception of man. The creative power given to man means that we can do whatever we have to do, not just for our own survival, but for 2, 3, 5, 10 generations ahead. Now, these conceptions don't come from academics. They come from fighters. Shakespeare was in the middle of a battle over whether England would be swallowed up by the Venetian oligarchy and turned into an extension of the Venetian Empire, or whether England might itself become the new republic, which had hoped to become under Henry VII. Now, most of these fights are real fights by real people in real time. And virtually every generation, or every time there's been a battle of this sort, it's occurred among people who are oppressed. That it's oftentimes from the midst of oppression, from the most vile and miserable circumstances, that people rise up to assert their true humanity. One great example of this we see in the case of Germany in the end of the 18th century. Now, at that time, Germany was not a unified country. This is actually from right after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, but it didn't change that much by 1800. These are all small duchies and principalities, Saxon duchies, the Würzburg, Hesse-Darmstadt, Hesse-Kassel. Some of these were city-states like Frankfurt. They were not unified. They were under local tyrants. And these local tyrants had life and death over the people who lived there. Now, these, of course, were Germans who lived here. But the German people had no freedom in these areas. Take, for example, two of the greatest people who came from the midst of this oppression. Actually, I'll show you four of them. The two collaborators, Lessing and Mendelssohn. In the case of Mendelssohn, here you have someone who was Jewish. Jews were non-citizens. They had no rights. A small number of them might be given the right to work as a banker because they were allowed to charge usury. But for the most part, the Jews were treated like a colonial people inside a colony with no rights, no freedoms. Yet Mendelssohn championed the idea of German unification. He said to the Jewish people, we must become citizens of Germany. And he said to the German people, including the Prussian emperor, that you can build your nation by giving us the right of citizenship. Moses Mendelssohn is an example of the sublime. A person who most of his life had to work at a regular job 12 hours a day, who had one child die at 10 months old, other children die in childhood. He had very little material comfort, and yet he wrote the most beautiful works on aesthetics. He was directly responsible for the work later of Schiller and von Humboldt through his collaboration with Lessing. Now, Schiller's another example. Many of you probably would not think of Friedrich Schiller as an oppressed man. I mean, after all, he was white, wasn't he? Now, Schiller had no right to choose what he wanted to do. He lived in a small area where the Duke had complete control over him. In fact, Schiller came from the area near Hesse, where the people were drafted into the army and sold to the British to go fight the British colonial wars. Schiller's father had been a mercenary soldier. Schiller himself, though he wanted to study theology, he wanted to write, instead he had to go for 8 years to become a doctor, to study to become a doctor, to serve in one of these armies. So he had no freedom. When he wrote his first play, he had to sneak into the next country to have that play produced. And once he came back, he was arrested. He was threatened if he ever wrote another play, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. This is the way an oligarchy suppresses ideas. And yet what Schiller did during his lifetime was fight for the liberation of all people. He worked very closely with a group who would get together at night and read poetry, discuss drama, discuss politics. This is Schiller, Goethe, and Alexander von Humboldt. They would gather together and discuss the news from America as they were trying to bring the ideas of the American Revolution to Germany. Probably most significant in the case of Schiller was his relationship with Goethe. Goethe is an example of someone who sought after public opinion. This is the famous statue of the two of them, which is right down the street from their house in this beautiful little town called Weimar. The name, the Weimar Classics, came from the collaboration between these two men. If you go to see Goethe's house, Goethe had a huge mansion. And as you go in, you see these lushly appointed rooms and these big couches that, with heavy cushions and gigantic murals of Roman gods and the rape of Lucretia and things of that sort. It's very sensual. But as you go upstairs to the top floor where he had his study, and Goethe, by the way, was an intelligence officer for the Duke in Weimar, his study was simple. He had a few rocks and crystals in a case, and you looked out the back window and there was a beautiful little garden, probably where the two of them met for their regular gatherings. And across the street, in a simple little beautiful yellow house, is where Schiller lived. Schiller rarely had any money, and yet Schiller acted for all of humanity in everything he did. And he was inspired by the ideas of the American Revolution, including, in particular, the Declaration of Independence. Amari? This is the first section of the Declaration of Independence.
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
Now listen to Schiller's use of these ideas in the famous scene from the play William Tell.
You want the hubbub? What's that? You want the hubbub? There's a limit to a tyrant's power. When men oppressed cannot find justice, when the burden becomes unbearable, then they, with confidence and courage, can reach to heaven and fetch their eternal rights from whence they hang, as indestructible and as inalienable as the stars themselves. Then nature's old primeval state recurs, where man to man must stand up in opposition, and as a last resort, when nothing else is of avail, the sword is given. Supreme possession we may well defend against tyrannic power. We guard our country, protect our wives, and protect our children.
You see the dialogue of ideas between the Declaration of Independence and Schiller's William Tell, which, by the way, was about the American Revolution, though it was set in Switzerland several centuries earlier. As Phil was talking earlier about the dialogue between Shelley and Shakespeare, the great humanists in history conducted an ongoing dialogue, such as that between Pico and Shakespeare, between that of the great work of art, the American Revolution, and Schiller's writings. And it's the role of the artist to take up arms against this oppression by calling on the best of man, by inspiring in man the sense of the man's true dignity and the rights of man to rise up to defend itself if necessary, as in the case of the Declaration of Independence and the Rutli Oath. So it's the artist who has a responsibility to develop in themselves those powers of good so as to inspire that in others. We hear this in Schiller in writing to the artist, in his poem, The Artist, where he says, one of Laney's favorite quotes, "The dignity of man is in your hands. Protect it. It sinks with you it shall ascend." That's the responsibility of the artist. Now, this is a constant theme in Schiller. In one of his late plays, The Bride of Messina, he does homage to the Greeks by writing the play with a chorus, going back to something which was developed in classical Greek drama, where you have the chorus speaking for the higher powers. And Schiller wrote a preface to The Bride of Messina in which he discussed what art must be. And he wrote the following in this preface: "True art is not intended as a mere passing fancy. Its earnest endeavor is not to transport man into mere momentary dream of freedom, but rather to make him actually free, and to do so by awakening, exercising, and developing within him his power to achieve an objective distance from the sensible world, which otherwise weighs down upon us like a dead object, pressing us like a blind force. This distance from the sensible world gives us the power to transform the material world into the free product of our own intellect and to exert dominion over it through ideas. See again the attack on the Aristotelian with the senses and the appeal to the intellect, the higher developed cognitive powers. And it's from this that you see where the concept of the sublime comes from. And I'm not going to develop the sublime now, it would take too much time, but as we've been discussing it, it's this commitment to that which is better so that there's no force in the world, including your own death, your ultimate destiny, that can force you to go against that higher nature of man. And it's that which we see in great leaders like Dr. King and others, which demonstrates the true nature of man. Now, we are the inheritors of these ideas. Schiller and Goethe, Shakespeare, Mozart, the Greek dramatists, worked for us. They worked for you to give you powers to shape your society. These ideas and the method of generating new and more powerful ideas give us the capacity to address man's historic paradox. And I'll cite that paradox in the following way. Given that the nature of man is good, and we can demonstrate the power of man to act for the good through the discoveries that are made and the transmission of ideas of these discoveries to improve the conditions of man, given that that's the nature of man, why has so much of human history been so damned ugly? Why has man's inhumanity to man seemed to dominate during most times of human history? Now, to answer that, I'm going to get very personal. I'm going to talk about your culture. Because you're going through something in your lives today which is designed to steal from you this great heritage, this great legacy, and instead to reduce you to the equivalent of human cattle, to cause you to embrace your own enslavement. Now, the case study will start with the following basic propositions. 1, our culture expresses an idea of man which is cynical and pessimistic, unlike Pico, unlike what Shakespeare said. Most of what we see in art today expresses this cynicism over man, this ugliness. Go into a modern art museum and what do you see? My favorite is, in one of these, something called Purple Door. It was a door that was painted purple and stuck up on the wall, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York paid $25,000 to the con artist who produced it. And what happens to a child who wants to study art and goes in at age 5 and says, "Daddy, why is that door up there?" And the father says, "The artist had a brilliant idea." Sort of like Phil's conception of ideas as a burp. The artist obviously was on an LSD trip one night, saw this door pulsing at him, and said, "What if I painted it purple? I wonder if I could sell that." Cynicism and self-degradation. Now, the second proposition here, the attack on the principle of great discovery, the attack, for example, on Kepler and Leibniz, on that scientific method, makes us the prisoners of sense perception. What's the point of thinking? Where does it get you? You got to be practical. Even while your parents are saying, you've got to get that degree, so stay in school. At the same time, what's the reason? Because they want you to learn truth, pursue truth? Just tell them, Dad, I think I'm going to pursue truth. I'm going to go to a LaRouche meeting. And you'll see what they really want. Oh, be practical. Get that degree. That's the entry point to a future. And you may point out to them, well, how many people with college degrees are now using their skills from their business administration classes to fill out unemployment forms? Meanwhile, they can't pay off their college loans. Well, if you destroy this conception of how the mind works and replace it with sense perception, that's essentially what you're doing to people. Now, a third proposition, there's no higher purpose to life. There's no mission. One of these slogans is, life is about getting all the toys you can. There's a new book for baby boomers, which is titled, How to Die Broke. It was a bestseller a couple of years ago. It was giving advice to baby boomers. Don't leave your kids anything. Just make sure you have enough money to last till you die. Let them fend for themselves. What's the mission in life? Just experience it. Just go along. Go for the gusto. Look for the pleasures. We'll be discussing some of these things much more tomorrow. And I've been told Laney has a very interesting series of transparencies on this. So if this is your view of what your life is about, then you're slaves. You're enslaved by a culture which is imposed on you. Now there's a tragedy to this. What is the tragedy? That we embrace our own enslavement. Now what I'm going to show now is how our culture, my culture and yours, was imposed on us by an alliance of Wall Street, paid academics such as people from the Frankfurt School, and organized crime. You don't own it. They own it. You don't even own your own soul if you go into this culture. And if you're in it now, there's still time for you to get out. Because what we've seen is a paradigm shift, what's called a paradigm shift, where all the values of a society are changed. We came out of World War II, as Lynn said in his own personal narrative today. When he came back from the war, he wanted to change the world. He wanted to get rid of British colonialism, to end the enslavement of the people of India and Africa and South Asia. This idea that America had a moral purpose. We defeated Nazism. We ended a depression. Now we're going to lift the rest of the world out of poverty. Well, what happened during the 60s is we lost that. And now we have what Lynn refers to as the no future or the I don't care generation. And most devastating, and most of you are probably not even that conscious of this, is that what's been taken from you, as I said, is this legacy, your historic connection to this tradition, this battle, which was waged by people explicitly for you. Friedrich Schiller did not wage this fight for his personal fame and glory and money. He didn't get much money. He died fairly young, and he lived in pain most of his life. He fought so that you could have these ideas and stand on his shoulders. And instead, you've had that connection to the past cut. And so in a sense, you go from nothing to nothing. So let's take a brief look at this culture. I just want to call your attention to one thing that will help you. It's a very useful pamphlet called Turn Off Your TV. And it goes through the conscious effort to use television to turn your brains into mush. Not just yours. I mean, my generation, tell you one of the things we remember from childhood. Television commercials like Speedy Alka-Seltzer. You wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent. I mean, the minds of young people are filled with this. Not so young people. Now, I don't watch enough television now to know what you're getting. It's commercials, but I'm sure it's gotten worse. Well, actually, I know one. Dude, you're getting Adele. Now, let me just go right to the heart of this thing and tell you something about MTV. If I can find my notes. Here we go. In 1956, a man named Theodor Adorno, one of the chief ideologues of the Frankfurt School, Frankfurt School was basically set up to destroy Western culture. It was consciously done so. You read their documents and you see it. They said the problem with mankind is that people in 1950s, after the war, were optimistic. This is a danger to society. Similar people in the 60s, the Rappaport Commission report wrote, the space program is doing a terrible disservice to our country because it's making the youth optimistic about the future. These guys wanted you to be pessimistic. So Theodor Adorno wrote in 1956, television is a medium of undreamed of psychological control. And he wrote an essay called Television and the Patterns of Mass Culture. How can you use television to create a homogeneous culture, a mass culture, so that everyone in every part of this country has the same ideas? In other words, how can you use television to control people? Now, MTV was set up deliberately to target people in the 12 to 25-year-old range. If you're older than 25 and you're still watching it, you didn't get the memo. You're supposed to switch to VH1 after you're 25. Music, which requires powers of concentration, and we'll get to this after I'm done a little bit later this evening. It's designed to elevate the power of reason, to cause you to think, to distinguish between different notes created by the human mind, taken from nature but put in a pattern which your inner ear hears. I've told some people, there's a famous neurosurgeon who's written a book who says that he recommends for people with aphasia, with strokes, with Parkinson's disease, and with Alzheimer's disease, that they listen to Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23 every morning, because he said he can prove it has regenerative effects to a mind that's attacked by disease. He also said it works for children who have been exposed to Ritalin and people who have been given some of these so-called antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs. So if any of you know anyone in that category, Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23 is supposedly an antidote to that. But in the late 19th century, there was something called Romanticism, which comes from the word Roman. It was reintroduced into music, the appeal to the emotion, not the mind, but to make you feel good. Music such as that is Wagner, as we've talked about before, which appeals to the senses. Now, MTV comes right out of that. It comes out of a project at the Tavistock Institute to try to figure out how can you create art that will hypnotize people, that will dull their ability to think, and cause them to go into literally hypnotic trances. And they said, well, one thing is repetitive beats. Another thing is very loud music. And another thing they said is some soothing words that cause you to not think. One of the people who worked on this project was Aaron Copland. Now, when MTV was set up, it was explicitly designed to create these kinds of visual and audio images that would create an excited state of expectation. This is from some of the people who were part of putting together MTV. There's a study done by a woman who was at State University of New York in Stony Brook named Ann Kaplan, who wrote a thesis on this. She said the purpose is to promote desires, fantasies, and anxieties in keeping with a postmodern consciousness. In other words, you have nothing to do with your life, you might as well fall into a vegetative state. Now, the viewer of MTV, especially if you have a big player, big music or television set, and surround sound stereo or whatever the latest is, you're overwhelmed by these audio-visual sensations. One of the people who worked on this studied Freud, and we'll talk a little bit about Freud tomorrow. Freud had this idea of the dream, the idea that you want to induce a dream, or that people often go into a dreamlike state through fantasy, and that this is to be preferred to people having anxieties. Well, with MTV, what they said is that they wanted to create images of rock videos that resemble a dream. The viewer is coaxed into a dreamlike state through repetitive flashes of colors and images, which overwhelm the visual apparatus. In Time magazine, in a study they had on MTV, they wrote that MTV has accelerated the process by which people are more likely to think in images than in logic. Now, by logic, they really mean creativity. Now, one of the creators of MTV is a guy named Robert Pittman. And Pittman wrote 10 years later this retrospective on what he did. He said, "We rely on mood and emotion. We make you feel a certain way, as opposed to walking away with any particular knowledge." This from one of the people who created it. He told the New York Times, "When you're dealing with a music culture, music serves as something beyond entertainment. It is really the peg that people use to identify themselves. It is representative of their values and culture." Now, let's take a little quick run through some aspects of our modern culture. How many of you are familiar with these dysfunctional people? The Seinfeld cast. Probably you know all kinds of stories about Kramer and George and Elaine and so on. Now, are any of these people the kinds of people you'd like to have as a friend? Why was this the #1 show for 6 years? They dupe us by saying it's a show about nothing. It's a show about something. It's a show about how you can look at your own hollow lives and think, other people have it worse. That's the whole purpose of this. You figure nobody's having a good life. I guess that's the way it's supposed to be. Now, let's make this more personal and get right down to this question of music. I want to show you the actual poetry of modern music. Now, some of you probably argue, and I've heard this many times. If I say something against rap, someone says, "Yeah, but there are great ideas in there. There's real poetry." Now, let's start with my generation. There is a group that came to the United States in 1963 from where? Great Britain, called the Beatles. Now, my wife, who's usually a sensible sort, tells me that when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time, she was sitting there screaming nonstop, and she didn't know why. She said she didn't like the music, she didn't really like them, but she couldn't stop. And whenever they played, nobody heard the music, which was probably better, because they played out of tune, they sang off key. But let's listen to the great poetry of John Lennon. Where's Montez? Okay, speak loudly.
Oh yeah. I'll tell you something.
Louder.
I think you'll understand. When I'll say that something, I want to hold your hand. I want to hold your hand. I want to hold your hand. Oh, please. Say to me, you'll let me be your man. And please, say to me, you'll let me hold your hand. Now let me hold your hand. I want to hold your hand.
Now you know why your parents are nuts? And by the way, to listen to that, it's better to smoke a lot of marijuana first. I'm not saying from personal experience. I had to do a lot of experimentation. Now, let's hear a more contemporary artist. Is Sam here? Okay, Sam will present a more contemporary piece of poetry by someone who has a movie out now who's considered the great, angry young poet of modern society.
Blow my buzz. By Eminem.
Blow my what?
Blow My Buzz.
By Eminem. Hey, yeah. This is one of them days when your ass just want to chill out and motherfuckers be all in your ear and shit. Know what I'm saying? Or that daddy bitch that just like to hear herself talk, blowing all your highway. Now that's some fucked up shit. Hey, but it happens. You know what I'm saying, yo? Yo, 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 yo. Schizophrenia. How many of you got it? How many motherfuckers can they say psychotic? How many motherfuckers can say they ride from pop? You got it? Like I got it or not? If you did, you would know just what I'm talking about. When you end up becoming so dependent on weed that you end up spending a G in a vending machine. You got the monkey, look at you, junk food junkie. Potato chips and lunch meat up in the front seat. Sometimes you get so paranoid from ganja that it's got to thinking the whole world's watching. Or maybe you don't smoke. Maybe you just don't. But whatever your drug, yo, go for the gusto. Just don't come fuck with me when I'm doing my drugs. You see me in the club, don't come fuck up my high and blow my buzz. You want to? Want to, just don't blow my buzz. Do what you want to, and I'm going to sit here and just roll my drugs, smoke my weed, and if you cough, I'm going to fuck you up. Whoop your ass. Just don't say shit, and we'll be cool.
Now, let me get to the point that I think is something that you guys have to think through. Because what's been done, especially to the African American community in this country, is a tragedy, especially after the civil rights movement, which took place in your parents' generation. Not that long ago, there were people marching for civil rights who had an idea of the dignity of man, who refused to go to the back of the bus, who refused to be denied the right to vote, who refused to be scared by brainless imbeciles in pointy white hats covering up their pointy white heads, and went out and fought for rights for all mankind, led by Dr. King. That was not so long ago. And look at the tragedy, and this is a tragedy in the sense that Lyndon LaRouche means, when you look at what rap music represents. You take a look at some of these characters, and I'll briefly present this. Some of you know this story, some of you may not. The notorious B.I.G. and Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, Sean P. Diddy Combs. Sean Combs, P. Diddy, said as a young man, I want to be a modern-day Mozart. He also said, if you're going to be a motherfucking thug, you gots to live and die a thug. Only thing I know is dead or in jail or about to be. Now, this is a case of someone whose father was a drug dealer, who was shot and killed when he was a very young boy, and who now is worth quite a bit of money and is a promoter of rap as a liberating force, Of course, the man who made a lot of the money for him, Biggie Smalls, the notorious B.I.G., who himself had been a crack dealer, is dead. Now, you take a look at the second person in this gallery, and you see what I think is actually a true tragedy. Not in him per se, Tupac Shakur, but look at the background. Here you have someone whose mother grew up in the 60s, Afeni Shakur, and who was a fighter. After Dr. King was killed, she joined the Black Panther Party. And whatever else you might want to say about the Black Panther Party, if you read their, I think it was 21 demands or list of principles, a lot of what they were talking about was feeding children, was making sure that the gains of the civil rights movement got into the ghetto. And they were descended upon aggressively by the Justice Department. Tupac's mother was framed up. She was part of, I think, the Black Panther 21 or the New Jersey 21 or something of that sort. She was in jail, in and out of jail for a long time waiting for her trial. And she was finally acquitted. But at that point, she was broken. And she spent most of the next 20 years in and out of rehabilitation centers with a drug addiction. Now, her son, Tupac, grew up many times shuttled around from family friend to family friend. His godfather was Geronimo Pratt, another victim of a DOJ Justice Department frame-up. But what became the life? What did he embrace? Here's a guy who went to the Baltimore School of Arts. He studied ballet, theater, and poetry. His teachers in Baltimore said he had a great affinity for drama. And yet what he did was adopt the idea that somehow what can be liberating is to embrace the oppression and live the so-called thug life. Now, what I want to say on this so-called thug life, it's going to be hard, but you got to listen to this and think about it. I think the main purpose of rap is to scare white people. Because most of the people who buy rap records are white. Most of the people who make money from rap records are white. The people who own and run the studios are mobsters or Wall Street people. And meanwhile, Biggie Smalls and Tupac are dead. There's a continuing war underway, just a few people killed in the last few weeks. And what's the message? Well, where's Freddie? Here we have the lyrics of one of this poet's works.
Fuck the World by Tupac Shakur. Who you calling rapist? Ain't that a bitch? You devils are so two-faced, want to see me locked in chains, dropped in shame, and getting socked by these crooked cops and gang. Fucking with a young black male, trying to stack bail and stay away from the packed jails. Told the judge I'm in danger, and that's why I had that 45 with the one in the chamber. Fuck the world. They're trying to say that I don't care. I woke up screaming, fuck the world. They're trying to say that I don't care. Just woke up and screamed, fuck the world. They're trying to say that I don't care. I woke up and screamed, fuck the world. They're trying to say that I don't care. Just got up and screamed, fuck the world.
Now the problem is that rage is not a liberating emotion. That the emotion of liberation is what we saw from Schiller, who also was oppressed, from Mendelssohn, from the people who freed this nation in an anti-colonial revolution against the British. And you should never forget that. The American Revolution was an act of a small number of people against the greatest empire of its day, people who had no money, very little hope for success, and yet an idea that was expressed in what you heard Lamari read earlier, the universal rights of man, the inalienable rights of man. Not, I want to get mine today. Now, one of the problems you see with Death Row Records, now called the Row Records, Bad Boy Entertainment and so on, is the promotion of an idea that tries to say that this is the same as Dr. King's fight. This is where we see the true tragedy. This is just taken from the LA Times 2 days ago. Now look at this sign. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Suge Knight. Suge Knight. What do those three names have in common? King fought for the justice and dignity for all mankind. And the fact that someone would think that this is the same fight, the fight right now between East and West Coast rap, or whatever you want to call it, it shows that we've created a culture of death. Now, who created it? I'm going to show you one of the godfathers of rap music. If it wasn't for this guy, there would be no rap music right now that anybody would have heard of outside of a few blocks in East Harlem. Steve Ross. Any of you know who Steve Ross is? Well, he started out running a parking lot for the mob. Now, why does the mob run parking lots? Because there's a lot of cash. And people don't know how much cash actually goes in, so you can launder money into the parking lot. And so he was set up by the Lansky mob, Meyer Lansky, directly under a guy named Abner Longy Zwillman, one of the most vicious hitmen in New Jersey in the 50s. Steve Ross was allowed to take over Kinney parking lot, and from Kinney parking lot they had so much money they took over a company called Warner Communications. Warner Communications, by the way, was the company that founded MTV. Ross directly had a hand in the founding of MTV. Now, Ross is a particularly bad guy, but as he became richer, he became more prominent. Here you see him with a few of his buddies at a fundraiser. Can't really tell. Spielberg and Geffen. And here he is with someone who to this day says, Steve Ross was my best friend. Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones, in a sense, is a link between the bebop and the rhythm and blues in the 40s and 50s and the rap music today. Now, one interesting thing on this, Quincy Jones has a daughter, Kidada, who for a brief period of time was somewhat of a cultural icon because she was the one who brought the idea of rap clothes to Tommy Hilfiger, another fighter from the hood. And she became the girlfriend of Tupac Shakur. And she demonstrated her political commitment to black liberation after Tupac was killed by becoming the girlfriend of Leonardo DiCaprio. There's no great culture and art in this. Let me just go through the MCA, Music Corporation of America, another one of these companies. And of the three leading companies in music, Warner Communications, MCA, and Universal, all of them are mob. They're mobbed up from the top to the bottom. MCA, some of you probably know, recently their head, Lou Wasserman, died. And the LA Times wrote all these articles about what a great, powerful man he was. Lou Wasserman got his start as a pimp in the streets of Cleveland, working for Mo Dalitz and the Cleveland mob. He came out to California where he worked under a guy named Sidney Korshak, who was one of the leading organized crime figures for 40 years in California. Despite the mob ties, and there are several books, one is by a guy named Dan Moldea called Dark Victory, if you want to research this. Lou Wasserman, by the way, one of his products, one of his proteges, you might say, was Ronald Reagan. But they were totally linked up with all the mob operations on the West Coast, including where records were distributed, which records were distributed, which records were played on radio stations. They owned a lot of radio stations. At one point, a member of the board of directors of MCA said, "I wonder if the young people in the ghetto know that 12 middle-aged Jewish white men are determining what their music is and what they listen to." On the board of directors of MCA was Robert Strauss, one of the fixers in the Democratic Party and a big enemy of ours, and Felix Rohatyn, one of the top Wall Street fixers. Now, one of their key operatives was also a guy named Morris Levy, who had got his start as a hitman for the Genovese family. Now I mentioned Warner Communications. The lawyer for Warner Communications was a man named Arthur Lyman. Lyman was a very prominent Wall Street attorney. He was the one, when they were investigating the Iran-Contra affair, and they were starting to look into the U.S. government's role in shipping cocaine into Los Angeles to finance the illegal war in Central America. This had the possibility of going straight to the White House, and George Bush Sr., who was the drug kingpin of America. Bush Sr., through his demented stooge, Oliver North, from the basement of the White House, was running cocaine from the Colombian cocaine cartel through Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana into Los Angeles to the Bloods and the Crips. That was a large part of starting the crack epidemic on the West Coast. In order to cover up this investigation, it was called the Walsh Commission, the Democrats, who were close to Steve Ross, through people like Robert Strauss and Felix Rohatyn, appointed this attorney, Arthur Lyman. And Lyman, supposedly prosecuting the case, ruled out the investigation of the drug connection. These are the kinds of criminals that you find involved in the movie and record business. Now, let me just summarize this picture. We do have two completely different conceptions of man. One is man as a being of feeling, who just wants to feel good, just wants to get over, just wants to get home after a tough day's work and chill, who has no higher purpose in life than the short-term immediate pleasures that are about all you can expect in this world. And of course, since the baby boomers invented sex in the 1960s, these include sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's one view of man. It's the view of man which many of you think is your culture. Now, some of the people who impose this do it for the money. I don't think the mob has some idea of, hey boys, let's go out and destroy the sovereign nation state. I really don't think Abner Longies Willman and Steve Ross got together and said, let's run this parking lot gig so we can go in and screw with the minds of people. But on the higher level, the level of the Frankfurt School, the level of Wall Street, it's exactly what they were doing, trying to destroy in you a sense of fighting for a better future, a sense of yourself as a human being, the crown of creation. So that's what was done to destroy a population so we could actually have an election in which people would choose between two completely incompetent and unacceptable candidates. Al Gore, who claims he invented the internet, and George Bush, who couldn't spell the internet if he had a dictionary and 4 advisors. And to this day, the American people say they like George Bush because they see in the president their own tragedy, their own limitations, their own fears. That's what Bush plays on. You're either for us or against us. They don't like our way of life. What's our way of life? Well, in the case of Bush, it's big belt buckles. He's not allowed to drink beer anymore. That's why his daughters do so much drinking. They've got to drink for him. You know, what they said one time is, how do you expect Bush to fight terrorism? He can't even stop his daughters from getting bombed. It wasn't my joke. But you have a president like that. What kind of nation do you have? Now, instead, we have the potential. If you guys are up for it, if you guys are willing to, as Schiller said, live in this century but be from another century, to see in yourself the ideal and to see that in others and help them fight to overcome their fears, their sense of littleness. And we have a great weapon in that, which is great classical culture. A culture which develops the human mind, the powers of concentration, that enables you to see the dignity of man in your fellow man and to fight for them, to end these kinds of tragedies, to give every child on this planet a potential to be an actor on the stage of history. So I'd like to conclude by just, well, actually, why don't we take questions, and then I have something I want to play for you in conclusion. So that's essentially what I wanted to say about who owns your culture. Yeah?
Do you think that nothing good can come out of our culture, or like the way we are right now?
I think nothing good can come out of their culture, which is imposed on you. But I think people here represent the proof that something good can come out of it. But the key word is out of it. If you stay in it, you will be swallowed up by this poison. Look, I'm not saying that if you listen to rap music, you're going to get gunned down as part of the East Coast versus West Coast rap. What I'm saying is it's taking away your humanity. To think about men and women in this way. And to say that, well, it may not be much, but it's ours. Look, one of the things Lynn wrote when I first joined was something called The New Left, Local Control, and Fascism. And he said the way fascism will come to the United States is by convincing people that the only thing they should fight for is something really small, but at least it'll be theirs. Some small sense of, well, this is mine. You can kill my family, you can poison my kids with crap in college, you can destroy Africa, but this little thing is mine. It's my music, it's my art, it's my baseball team. I mean, think about this. You get people who get into fistfights over the Oakland Raiders. How many people who dress up in the stands like barbarians and Visigoths in some kind of silver and black with unicorn things out, and they're brawling in the parking lots. How many shares of stock do they own in the Oakland Raiders? My team, Raider Nation. The same thing is done in sports that we're talking about in music. So if you understand that this is a culture that was created to destroy you, and that in fact, because you're human, and because you have these higher faculties, then you can, this generation, as Lynn said, could be the generation that does something that's never been done before. We can defeat the oligarchy and actually establish truly human culture on this planet for the first time in history, where we can defeat poverty, we can defeat disease, we can explore the universe. That's what this legacy and tradition is open to you. If you choose to step out of this culture which basically says, you ain't nothing, fuck the world. Other questions? Yeah.
What place do your feelings have in this?
Could you speak up?
What place do your feelings have in the humanist mentality?
Well, feelings are important. Schiller writes about the aesthetical education of man, in which he's basically talking about that what we have to develop with great acuteness is our passion for humanity. And he talks about the desire to do one's duty with great passion. For example, if you know the actual situation in Africa right now, let's just take a couple of countries. Take Zimbabwe. Here's a country that was a colony of Britain until 1978. It was still controlled by the British. Hell, it was named after some British fat imperialist named Cecil Rhodes until 1978. It was called Rhodesia. They finally got their independence in 78. The British promised land reform because in that country, 2% of the population owned over 90% of the good farmland. And the British said, well, we'll put some money forward to help the poorer farmers there. To this day, they still haven't. So after 20-something years, a group of farmers, black farmers in Zimbabwe, organized, and they said, if you won't give us the land, we'll take some of it. And the white farmers formed a militia and started shooting at them. So they fought. There were a few people killed, and the press went crazy, attacking Mugabe, the president, for supporting the people who were trying to take the land that was promised to them 24 years ago. And because they don't have the land, there are people starving in Zimbabwe. You go nearby to Zambia, where the life expectancy has been reduced from something like 58 years to 39 years because of AIDS and other epidemic diseases that are just ravaging that country. You look at Zaire, the Congo, where so-called civil wars have left over 3 million children dead, mostly not from bombs or landmines or killing, but from dying miserable lives, 4- and 5-year-olds whose parents have died of AIDS, dying in these so-called refugee camps, which are really just breeding pools for disease. This is genocide. Now, can you feel something for those kids, the children of Africa? That's where feelings come in. The emotion which says, I'm going to fight with whatever powers I have, as though those were my children. To have that passion for humanity. That's where emotion and feelings come in. And that's what Schiller talks about in his wonderful work, The Aesthetical Education of Man, which Laney has been working both in Los Angeles and also Seattle, going over these great letters. Yeah?
Don't you see how music and rap can be used as vehicles to publicize these things that you're talking about? I mean, and as far as the fervor with which you speak almost seems to imply that rap is this inherently negative, monolithic force. You don't even bring up people like Coolio, for instance, who have very positive messages. KRS-One.
All right, let me answer that in a very sharp way.
Okay.
Do you see a mass movement lining up of people who listen to Coolio going to fight for those children in Africa?
Fight for those children in Africa. I mean, they do benefits, They do benefits to support good causes. I mean, this happens all the time. Look, you need to study these things. The money doesn't go to the people it's supposed to go to. Okay.
The money is put back in this pool of, do you know when Willie Nelson was doing his benefits for the farmers? More money went to pay for the dope Willie Nelson smoked on stage than ever got to farmers. Supposedly they raised $25 million. Less than $1 million ever got out to any farmer. Because everyone who sang there demanded a separate trailer, demanded white roses, demanded kegs of beer, demanded security, demanded fancy hotels.
Those are, okay,
No, you see, but you don't understand. No, you don't understand something. If someone sets out to produce a disease to kill you, and then says, but we'll put a couple dollars over here to a charity, it's not good. Let me give you another example.
I've been inspired by a lot of modern music and rap too. I don't know how, I just think that you want to lump it all, you take these isolated, there's certainly a lot.
I could have taken hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these people.
You're right, there is internalized racism in rap and that needs to be eradicated. I agree with you.
But it won't be eradicated. It's part of that culture.
It turns to a form of music. There's nothing necessarily
because you didn't listen. You didn't listen.
A style.
You didn't listen to the first part of what I said. The only human culture is one that actually starts from developing in each human being the capacity to concentrate to address the great problems confronting man. And what we've done is because we've seen so much ugliness is that we've adapted ourselves to the idea that if anything good comes out of this, we should grab onto it. Instead of the idea of fighting the evil, instead of fighting the evil. You see, I'll give you an example. Let me tell you, I was on a radio show not too long ago. One of the things I do, I'm one of LaRouche's national spokesmen, so I do a lot of radio shows. I was doing a radio show on Reverend Moon in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And a minister called in and he said, well, what do you do if you've got a preacher who's got a small church and he can't raise enough money in his church to keep the church going, and Moon comes and offers him money? Isn't it okay to take that money to continue his ministry? And I said, well, how would you counsel a young woman who came in to you and said, I have to go out and be a prostitute to feed my children? Now, people in the moral majority might say, well, good, she's got family values. But that's not the point. The point is that Reverend Moon is taking over the poor churches by going out dangling money and watches. Because, you see, but why? 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 Because we have a culture which doesn't value the higher qualities of man. I want you to just think about that. Think about what I've said in terms of this idea of the concept of the beauty and dignity of man that should be there with everyone. But to get it, to actually grasp these ideas, it's not enough just to repeat them. You actually have to go through a process of moral and intellectual development as a child, an educational process, which gives you that power. And we have instead an educational system which destroys that doesn't encourage concentrated work. Especially with parents now having to work 3 jobs to pay off their credit card debts and their home mortgages, where are children most of the time?
More that we have technological media that prevent us from doing that. From like this, we have cable TV, we have so many choices before us and this is why almost all of us have attention deficit disorder.
Well, so that's where we have to start the fight. Just think about what Schiller said. Talk about this question of websites. Do you know the studies were done in several companies that have everyone with PCs and wired up to the internet, and they find that 1/3 to 40% of the time in offices, people are on porn sites and sports betting sites. Now, why is that? Why are there so many porn sites? In fact, if you make a slight mistake, you could end up, I've got this thing that pops up on my email all the time. It says message from Mike. And the first time I saw it, I have a brother named Mike. So I said, oh, Mike sent me an email. And I turn it on, and next thing you know, there are women, 3 women doing unspeakable things to some guy.
Well, I'll tell you why. It's what Bertolt Brecht called the alienation of how this is what he thought, and I think there's a lot of merit to what he said, that technology has a tendency to alienate people.
It's not technology. It's deliberate corruption.
Why else do people look to pornography? It's
because it's very difficult for them to fight through to be truly human. You see, the ability of a man and a woman to have a loving relationship that lasts a lifetime is almost wiped out in our society because we're bombarded by these images of, and again, Laney will hit that tomorrow. We'll hit a lot of this again tomorrow. I'd like to take some other questions, but think about this question, the dignity of man. To have true human dignity, you have to fight against the easy short-term thrills that come from most of our culture that are there to pull people away from fighting for the good. So we can talk about this more tomorrow because I think that there's a lot that has to be said in terms of this question of the focus on sex in our culture, which is part of what's destroying people. Yeah? I think that's the wrong question because it's the wrong question because here's the reason it's the wrong question. Suppose you have an evil dictator like Hitler who gave money to a few orphans of people who were killed in the war. would you say, well, see, some good comes out of Nazism?
Are you comparing Nazism?
No, I just made an analogy. You see, the problem is, I made an analogy which you don't understand. And it's a problem of being able to think. You're saying, the question is, can something good come out of evil? And I'm saying, no, it can't. It's not a different type. No, it's not a different type. It's not a different type of music. I consider human music to be that which inspires love of man for the beauty of man.
You think Beethoven's Fifth Symphony does that? That's scary.
Yeah, no, I think Beethoven's Fifth Symphony does do that.
Oh, it's a joy listening me up, but and I appreciate the Fifth Symphony, but it's not something that makes me want to go out and, makes me want to, whatever, uplift humanity.
Well, actually, then maybe you should listen to it differently. Maybe you should listen to it differently.
Every type of music can affect other people in a different way. This music affects you that way, and that's great.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, let me go back to this question I had. If you took a look at the actual degree of injustices going on in this country, the deliberate murder that's going on of the African continent, the murder that's going on now in Argentina, in Brazil. Liz can tell you about what's going on in Mexico. Now, if you have compassion for humanity, if that's what you get from rap, then you would be joining our movement to fight against that injustice. But what I'm saying is that what people do is they choose a culture that makes them feel comfortable with inactivity.
I live in that culture, and I believe in helping humankind, but I also think that all these things that are in our culture right now are good. You can't deny that our human race has come to a different thing.
Our human race is about to destroy itself based on the illusion that free trade is good. Most people in economics departments in this country teach that free trade is good. You look at every country that's had free trade and you find the nations have been destroyed. Now, why do people not see reality? Because you need a cognitive quality to actually see something that's not immediately in front of you. And most people are incapable of seeing that because of all the crap that's poured into their heads all the time. Yeah. The answer to the question, if you want to take it as that simple question, I don't think there's anything good in rap. Yeah.
I wonder if, I think it's outside of this as well, but I think it's also a problem that people take TV and music as a way of life. And maybe sometimes if you see a little bit, it's just supposed to entertain people in a way, but now young people are taking that like a way of like that's reality.
Well, that's an important point.
The problem that we make is it's not that it's evil, but it's the people are taking it that's all there is to.
What I'm saying, remember, I said this is a tragedy. The people behind the music that I'm talking about, behind television, behind most of the movies that you go see, the people behind it have an intention. And that intention is to dumb people down, to destroy their sensibilities, to make them comfortable with a life that doesn't get very far. Now, the tragedy is that people embrace that and say, that's my music, that's my culture. friend and I miss him. Or my dog just ate my mother-in-law. Come here, Fido. There's these aspects of so-called culture are created to attack this conception of man in the image of God. Now, the tragedy is that people embrace them, and they take them, as you say, personally. Now, I think what I would really encourage people to do is to step back a second and listen and participate in some great culture, because it's not in your life. You know, most of you probably think of opera as something rich people do to go out and show off their furs. And probably have no idea, and by the way, there's a lot of bad opera. There's a lot of bad so-called classical or romantic music.
It's more just a style that we don't respond to. It's like, you can change someone's mind, but you can't change their hearts, really, I don't think.
Well, in fact, in fact, you do have to change people's hearts, because right now, most people's hearts are not so good. And let me just tell you what I mean by that. I think people are good, and if they had leadership, and if they had truth in their life. Take this case I'm bringing up. If each of you would devote, let's just say for the next 3 weeks, the amount of time you'd listen to whatever is your favorite music or watch your favorite television, if you would devote that time to studying what's happening in Africa and why, and then say, okay, I'm not going to let this happen. How do I fight it? I think you'd become much better people. And I don't mean that you're bad people. I'm saying that the culture has forced you to think there's nothing you can do about it. So you have to accept it. That's what I mean by saying a culture has been created to make you comfortable with things that are not good. I've studied a lot, for example, what happened in Nazi Germany. And I can tell you that most Germans did not believe that Hitler would follow through with what he said he was going to do. Even after Hitler started gassing the Jews, people didn't believe it or didn't want to believe it. And what was the problem? They didn't think they could do anything about it. They had become little. The World War I experience so damaged people in Germany. And look at German culture. It was a beautiful culture. After World War I, you had hyperinflation. People had to take wheelbarrows of money to buy a loaf of bread. Then after that, crushing unemployment. The nation was put through total turmoil, and what came out of it? Hitler. And Hitler said, you back me, and I'll make an economic recovery. But he also said, we've got to get rid of the Jews. He also said, we've got to get rid of communism and kill the communists. People didn't hear that because all they heard is maybe things will get better. And so what I'm saying is that we, as a human, if you study history, we've gone into dark ages because people didn't want to face the truth and reality, and instead were lulled into a form of comfort that made them incapable of rising to the occasion of a great moment. Now, the challenge here that we posed this morning, and this is something that Lynn said to all of you, we have the capacity now, because of the crisis worldwide, the vacuum in leadership, the lack of an alternative. Look what the Democratic Party did this last time. They put up no opposition whatsoever. We have the capacity to put someone in the White House in 2004, and maybe even get his programs implemented before that, that will create an economic recovery not only in this country, but for the whole world, that you can fight for and you can be a part of. This is something new, something that's a new potential. And I think it's incumbent on each of you to step back from your momentary sense of hurt feelings and look at what I'm saying about that. You can do something great for all of history, as opposed to have a sense that, well, you hurt my feelings because I actually like this. Think about what your responsibilities are as human beings at a time of great existential crisis for humanity. Yeah.
Okay, I think that some of the political views that you guys are talking about are really important, because our world is not functioning, not being human people, caring for each other. So why is it that
Well,
there's two ways of good. I mean, people get it mixed up all the time. What is good? And there's a play out there called Good, and it's about how the normal doctor turns into a Nazi by seeking but there's two different kinds of good. There's innocent good, and then there's innocent good. I mean, I think you tend to tend as rap as not being innocent good.
well, I'm saying, I really shouldn't have to repeat this, but I will. Look at who promotes it and why. They say openly that they want young blacks killing each other, defending the idea of the thug life instead of fighting for civil rights. Now, look into that. Look into that and think about what that means.
Because those the oligarchs of the music industry, those aren't the artists. The artists get ripped off all the time.
But the point is that the artists are playing their part in the scheme.
A lot of them do play the game.
Well, but they play the game to the point that they're victims of the tragedy.
I agree with you.
Okay, well, let's stop the tragedy. And the tragedy is not with the individual artist, it's with the population that's soft on these questions. It's a population which, out of some sense of we can't attack popular opinion. So many people like this. If you attack this, then you're going to turn them off. Well, what if they finally realize that part of the reason they're losing their job and part of the reason that they're losing their health care, like take Los Angeles. The city has gone from 23 trauma centers to 12 trauma centers, and it may go down to 8 trauma centers. That means if you live in greater LA and you're in a car accident, a serious car accident, your chances of dying just went up about 100%. Now, why did that happen? Because everyone in the state legislature in 1996 voted for deregulation of energy. Now, would you say, well, the people who voted for it thought it would be good? Maybe they did. Maybe they thought it was good. But you could have proven to them then, as we did in our publications, that if you deregulate electricity, a bunch of crooks out of Houston are going to come in and steal billions of dollars. We told the governor that. We told them that. They said, oh no, it'll make things more efficient, more cheap. And now you have elderly people who can't put on air conditioning in the summer or heat in the winter. You have people who are going to die in car accidents and shootings and stabbings and things of that sort, who could have been saved had we kept the money, had we kept the policy of regulation, which would have meant we wouldn't have gone $24 billion in debt in Los Angeles. Now you could say, well, they didn't know. They did know. We told them. Every time in history there's been deregulation, a small group of people steal from the poorest people. So how did they sell it this time? They went to the poor people and say, you're going to get your electricity rates lowered if we have deregulation. And people said, oh, goody. Now, why didn't people study for a minute the history of deregulation? Why didn't they listen? Because the quick answer was save money. And people fell for it. Now, this is the point I'm making. The people pushing these policies know what they're doing. And so our job is to equip the population with the political intelligence to know when you're being snookered, to know when you're being reduced, so that it won't happen again. And that way we can build a movement to defeat this. Yeah?
I'm with you. However, I have a concern. It's this. How is someone like Quincy Jones and his music different than someone like Schlanger, who was a wonderful, and I'm not going to pronounce his name right, who was a wonderful composer and a Nazi? You know, like, how is that different? I don't know.
Well, you see, I would say in this that Wagner was not a wonderful composer, and in fact, but you see, Wagner is a perfect example of this. Let's forget the hip-hop culture in the United States today. Let's go back to the hip-hop culture in Germany in the 1860s, where there was a psychotic named Richard Wagner who promoted the idea that there's a small group of people who are the Aryan people, who are the superior race, and everybody else is bad and weak and should be destroyed, and who wrote operas that promoted this idea. Who funded Wagner? The most degenerate oligarchy of South Germany. And Wagner openly stated in an essay he wrote called The Jew in Music that we have to free music from the control of the Jews. And people who went to hear this said, "Oh, these operas are so wonderful. They lift me to the heights." But you see, here's what I'm saying. That if a guy tells you he hates Jews, he's out to destroy classical music, and his music is terrible, you don't go along with it. Now, I'm not saying he should have been shot and his music burned. I'm saying that people who knew better should have gone out and waged a fight against it. For example, Clara Schumann, the wife of Robert Schumann, after seeing Tristan and Isolde, said, "I've never seen anything so terrible in my life." She's...
I guess I just thought I misinterpreted you. I thought that you said Wagner was a positive thing.
Oh no, I was saying that Wagner's an example. See, Wagner was the original light show, the original Madonna. They built a place for him called in Bayreuth, this huge theater, which was outside, and you know, they had clashing cymbals and loud noise and sound effects. They'd set off bombs practically in the area. And every year they go there. Wagner's widow referred to Hitler as our holy Adolf, unser seliger Adolf. That's the initials USA. The Wagner children were raised in Hitler's lap. Hitler played Wagner's music while the Jews were marched to the concentration camps. Now in Israel, up until last year, they never played Wagner. And last year, for the first time, they played Wagner. And it nearly led to riots, because whatever else people in Israel are, they're at least aware of that history. And the conductor who conducted is not going to be invited back. So the point I'm making is that if you study history, if you study these things, don't just respond to the emotions on the surface. Think about what I'm saying. I don't care if you agree or not, we can fight it out, but think it through before you react. Because you're defending something which really isn't yours. You may have adopted it, but it really isn't yours.
What's art then? Anything that we create, right? So you can create your own music and your own art.
Well, you can, but it's unlikely if you were to form a rock band right now and go out and practice for a while. I'm just saying it's unlikely that you would get a contract from organized crime in Wall Street to produce it unless it was really bad. Then you might become someone who's well known. What I'm saying is, what I presented at first, go back to how I started this with Dr. King. What was key for the civil rights movement? It was the African American spirituals, where you had people who lived under the most miserable conditions as slaves, and yet they created a beautiful music, a music of hope and love and yearning, a music that also contained within it secret coded messages. And old Massa was out there saying, "Oh, look at those dumb happy field hands, they's out there singing away." And these guys were planning their escape using the music. Now, one of the key things with the African American spiritual is it's a part of a genuine folk music. That's part of what I consider my musical heritage. Just as the work of Bach, the work of Mozart. This is when I talk about the great lasting things of history that have made people better throughout history. That's our legacy. 200 years from now, you're not going to know about the Beatles except studying what were people doing in 1960. The music has no lasting value. But 200 years from now, if there's a civilization, people will still listen to Mozart and Bach and Beethoven. Yeah?
I'm curious what method you use, or how is it judged to look for your experience? I'm wondering what criteria.
Well, the criteria I presented tonight is what it is that makes you more sensitive to the beauty of your fellow man, so that you're willing to risk your life to fight for every person's freedom. If you think about the spiritual I started with, oh freedom. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. The idea of fighting for something beyond your immediate self, having that kind of mission in life. A culture which gives you that sense of fighting for the betterment of all human beings. That's what I consider a human culture. And I think, did you want to say something else? Were you,
How do you propose to implement this among the American people when, say, LaRouche becomes president? How do you propose to start this,
Well, we used to have presidents who understood something about culture.
Will you play Bach on MTV? I mean, what?
That would be a good start, but no, if you listen to LaRouche's webcast, they always open with Bach. You see, that John Kennedy, when he was president, used to have Pablo Casals come to the White House quite often. And Kennedy said that a nation must honor great art at least at the level that we honor advances in the sciences and in business. And the idea of a president who actually is cultured, as opposed to what we've had recently. I mean, Jimmy Carter used to invite Greg Allman into the White House, and Allman said, we always smoke pot in the Lincoln bedroom. I mean, Clinton didn't do things quite that bad in the Lincoln bedroom. Now, the point is, a president who actually thinks on this kind of universal level is what would present a great advance. What I'm advocating for you is think about this. And what I'd like to do now is move to the next part of what we're going to do, which is actually have some singing and have some culture. And for you to engage in it, well, the criteria I presented tonight is what it is that makes you more sensitive to the beauty of your fellow man, so that you're willing to risk your life to fight for every person's freedom. If you think about the spiritual I started with, oh freedom.
We saw the pictures of the people with those bulges coming out of different places of their body. A picture of someone today going through that. She went over the economic policies that are causing it. There's 2, 3 different questions. People's going to go, oh, that's really interesting, And then you get another one, Phil, talking about the fundamental difference between man and a beast. And again, 2 or 3 questions, again, a very academic response. Oh, these people are interesting. Look at what they're talking about. Then we start talking about your culture. And we sit down and reflect on the passion that you put into defending something like that. And the passion you didn't put into trying to figure out how do we stop that dark age that we was talking about? And how do we understand the difference between men and animals? Because this phenomenon is the same. 12 graduate school, 3 different countries. It's just exactly the same. It's very interesting. Just sit down and reflect on that.
And if you have any of these in our offices, take a look at it and see how conscious the creation of television culture is on this. Okay? So, thank you.